They say some secrets are buried so deeply that even the earth refuses to remember them. But this one refused to stay hidden. In the lonely plains of Kansas, 1897, where the wind howled through empty fields like the whispers of forgotten souls, a family existed that the world would never understand. A brother and sister, twins, so intertwined in body and mind that they became something unnatural, something beyond the boundaries of morality. You will hear this story now, but once you do, it cannot be unheard. The twins, Phoebe and Wilbert, were born into isolation, left almost entirely to themselves after a tragedy stole their mother. Their father, a stern, devout man, tried to shield them from the world, thinking that seclusion could protect them. But what he did not know, what no parent could ever predict, was that isolation can twist innocence into obsession. By the time they were grown, their connection was no longer sibling-el. It was a bond that defied reason, a silent pact forged in shadows, spoken only through glances and subtle gestures that would unsettle anyone who dared to observe. When they made their choice to marry each other, the world around them didn't just shudder, it recoiled. Because this was not a simple act of rebellion or youthful arrogance. It was a deliberate, calculated plan to forge a dynasty. A dynasty built on blood, secrecy, and something far darker than mere ambition. And what they created after that, the children they bore, the rituals they performed behind locked doors, the house that grew more labyrinthine with every passing month, it became a microcosm of control, a laboratory of obsession, a monument to forbidden knowledge. The locals whispered, but no one dared approach. Even the most seasoned hunters, the men who roamed these plains for danger and sport, avoided the property after sundown. They felt something there, something wrong, something alive and watching, but no one could name it. And now, I will take you into that darkness. Step closer, because what you are about to hear is not just history. It is a blueprint of human obsession, of the capacity for cruelty disguised as love. It is a window into the mind of people who believed they could define nature itself. And perhaps they almost did. Phoebe and Wilbert were not like other children. From a moment they could walk, they seemed to exist in a world apart, a parallel reality that no one else could enter. Their hair, almost white under the harsh Kansas sun, and their piercing blue eyes gave them an otherworldly appearance that unsettled anyone who looked too long. But it was not just their appearance. It was the way they communicated. Visitors to the property often noticed it immediately. Their glances, their subtle nods, the way one would start a sentence and the other would finish it perfectly, as if their thoughts were one. At first, it seemed like the innocence of twins, the natural bond of siblings who had never been apart. But as the years passed, it became something more, something deliberate. When Phoebe was 11, a single trip into the nearby town changed everything. Children there mocked her paleness, whispered cruel things, and laughed in a way that pierced the soul. Her father, already protective, saw rage where others might see embarrassment. He decided that the world outside was toxic, that exposure to society would only corrupt them. From that day forward, the twins were even more secluded. School was abandoned. Friends were forbidden. Visitors became rarer than the snowfall in winter. And so, the house became their universe. Each creaking floorboard, each shadowed corner, every locked door shaped their understanding of the world. By the time they reached adolescence, their connection had deepened into something that defied explanation. They would spend hours in the attic, whispering in tones their father could not understand, their eyes locked in a silent conversation that excluded him entirely. When he entered the room, they would continue as if he were invisible, their focus only on each other. It was in those hours, in that attic, that the first seeds of their plan were sown. They began to study their family's past, their grandfather's books on genealogy and heredity, searching for patterns, rules, loopholes. They were forming a vision that the world would never see coming. And in that vision, there was only one path: to preserve themselves, to preserve the bloodline, no matter the cost. It was here, in the isolation of a house at the edge of the world, that the ordinary became unnatural, where love became obsession, and obsession became a doctrine. And it is in this attic, unseen, unheard, that the true darkness of their story began to take shape. A darkness that would reach far beyond the walls of that house and into the very fabric of their descendants' lives. By the time Phoebe and Wilbur turned 18, their isolation had transformed them into something almost inhuman. The playful innocence of childhood was gone, replaced by a precision and calculation that chilled anyone who dared notice. They moved through the house with a synchronicity that was uncanny, finishing each other's thoughts, gestures, even meals, as if one were merely an extension of the other. Their father, Waldo, once the center of their world, now found himself irrelevant, a spectator to a bond he could not understand. It was during this period that the first seeds of a plan emerged. Hidden among the stacks of dusty tomes left by their grandfather, they pored over books on bloodlines, family dynasties, and the manipulation of heredity. Animal breeding, genealogical treatises, obscure historical accounts of rulers who married within their own families. They absorbed it all, methodically, like scholars obsessed with a single goal. One evening, Waldo stumbled upon them in the attic, sitting in silence, staring at one another for hours without speaking. Their eyes glimmered with a focus he had never seen before, and for the first time, a cold suspicion took root in his mind. The silence between them was not mere tranquility. It was a covenant, a silent agreement sealed in the dark corners of the house. And then came the whispers, not audible words, but a subtle communication, gestures, glances, nods, shifts in posture. Waldo tried to intervene, tried to ask questions, tried to understand, but they would not respond, except with a calm, unnerving certainty that left him trembling. When they spoke, it was in quiet tones meant only for each other. When they moved, it was in perfect, mirrored motion, as if they shared a single body. And slowly, imperceptibly, their conversations began to drift to the unthinkable. To protect the bloodline, Wilbert whispered one night, so quietly Waldo barely heard, "We must do what others fear." Phoebe nodded, her eyes reflecting the candlelight, unblinking, unshaken. They had begun to plan, meticulously, deliberately, a union that would define nature, law, and morality. Waldo felt it before he understood it. The creeping dread that this was no youthful rebellion, no harmless eccentricity. This was a deliberate transformation of their lives into something almost sacred in their eyes. And in that moment, in the dim light of the attic, Waldo realized he was no longer the guardian of his children. He was merely a witness. And what he would witness next would not only redefine his family, but cast a shadow over the generations yet to come. The day Phoebe and Wilbur revealed their decision was the day the air itself seemed to turn cold. Waldo had returned from the sawmill, unaware that the world he thought he controlled was already slipping from his grasp. The twins were waiting for him in the living room, sitting side by side, their posture calm, almost regal. He could sense, before they spoke, that something extraordinary and forbidden had been decided. "Father," Phoebe said softly, her voice steady, "we are to be married." Waldo blinked, certain he had misheard. "Married?" he stammered. "To whom?" Wilbert's expression remained neutral, but the weight in his gaze made Waldo's stomach turn. "To each other," Wilbert replied simply, as though declaring the weather outside. Time seemed to stop. Waldo felt the Bible in his hand suddenly heavier, as though it too sensed the transgression. He tried to argue, to reason, to invoke the laws of nature and the rules of society. He shouted, pleaded, cited scripture, but the twins remained unmoved. Their conviction was absolute, their logic unshakable. They had studied their grandfather's books in secret, and from those dusty pages, they had drawn a conclusion they believed undeniable, that the purity of a family could only be preserved by uniting its own blood. History, they argued, was littered with examples of families who married within, who preserved wealth, power, and traits across generations. Every protest Waldo raised, every moral objection, was met with a calm, calculated rebuttal. They had thought through every legal loophole, every societal obstacle, every practical consequence. They were no longer children, no longer subjects to parental authority. They were architects of their own destiny. The ceremony, they declared, would happen on the property behind locked doors, with no witnesses other than Waldo himself. He felt trapped, complicit by default, powerless to stop what was unfolding. And yet, as he looked at them, Phoebe's pale, unyielding eyes, Wilbert's cold, calculating smile, he sensed something else, something even more terrifying. They believed, without question, that what they were doing was right. Not rebellious, not wicked, but correct. In that chilling certainty, Waldo realized that the house he had built, the land he had claimed, the children he had raised, none of it mattered anymore. They had created a new reality, one in which he could no longer intervene. That night, the air in the house felt heavier, oppressive, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the gravity of the twins' choice. And somewhere, deep in his mind, Waldo knew that this was only the beginning, that what would follow would be more unnatural, more calculated, and more horrifying than anything he could imagine. Because once the pact was made, once the bloodline was sealed in this forbidden act, there would be no turning back. The morning of the ceremony arrived without celebration, without witnesses, without the warmth that usually surrounds a union between two people. Instead, the Oates property stood silent beneath a pale Kansas sky, the wind moving slowly through the dry grass like a whisper that refused to speak aloud what was about to happen. Waldo stood behind the house with a heaviness in his chest that felt almost physical, as if the land itself was pressing against his lungs. Before him stood Phoebe and Wilbert, dressed not in proper wedding garments, but in simple white clothes they had stitched themselves. They looked eerily calm, their pale faces untouched by doubt or shame. If anything, they appeared proud, as though they were stepping into a destiny only they could understand. There was no pastor, no legal document, no sacred blessing. Just the twins, facing one another with that same unsettling stillness they had shared since childhood. Phoebe spoke first, her voice soft but unwavering, repeating vows she had written in secret weeks earlier. Wilbert answered with the same precision, every word measured, deliberate. Their hands met, fingers intertwining with a familiarity that no ritual could justify. Waldo felt his stomach twist violently. He tried to interrupt once more, tried to speak against it, but the words died in his throat. Something about the way they looked at him, cold, patient, almost amused, made it clear that his authority had vanished long ago. When the vows ended, the silence that followed was suffocating. There was no applause, no blessing, just the quiet rustling of the wind and the terrible understanding that the act had been completed. The twins had crossed a line that society, law, and nature itself had always forbidden. But for them, this was not rebellion. This was the beginning of something far greater. That evening, the house felt different, as though its walls had absorbed the weight of the ceremony. Phoebe and Wilbert moved into the master bedroom together, sealing their union behind a locked door. Waldo began spending more and more time at the sawmill, working long hours not because the work demanded it, but because the house no longer felt like home. At night, he could hear them moving upstairs, whispering, discussing things in low voices he could never quite understand. And slowly, almost quietly, the twins began to reshape the house itself. Windows were covered with boards. New locks appeared on doors that had never been locked before. The basement, once a simple storage space, became the center of constant activity. Hammering echoed through the floorboards late into the night. When Waldo asked what they were building, Phoebe simply smiled and said something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "A future," she said softly. "A future for our family." But what Waldo did not yet realize, what no one in Kansas could have imagined, was that the twins were not simply building a home for children. They were constructing the foundation of something far darker, a bloodline engineered in secrecy, designed according to rules that belonged not to nature, but to obsession. The first pregnancy changed the atmosphere of the house in ways that even Waldo could not ignore. It arrived quietly, almost predictably, as if the twins had anticipated the exact moment it would begin. Phoebe never announced it with excitement or fear, the way most women did in those years. Instead, she spoke about it with a strange calm, as though the child growing inside her was not a miracle of life, but the next step in a carefully planned experiment. Sitting together late at night, surrounded by books and papers, whispering to each other in that silent language of glances and subtle gestures that had always made outsiders uncomfortable. The house grew quieter during those months, but beneath that quietness was something tense and unnatural. Phoebe rarely left the property anymore. When she did, Wilbur walked beside her like a shadow, never letting her speak alone with anyone in town. The local merchant began to notice something odd about their purchases. They were buying supplies in unusual quantities: medical tools, thick cloth, large jars of chemicals, and crates of preserved food. It looked less like a household preparing for a baby and more like a laboratory preparing for a long isolation. Waldo felt a constant dread creeping into his thoughts, but he could never quite prove that anything truly wrong was happening. The twins behaved politely when spoken to. They answered questions calmly, but there was something in their eyes that felt detached from ordinary human emotion, as though they were already thinking far beyond the child that was about to be born. When the winter storms arrived that year, the Oates property became completely isolated. Snow buried the roads and swallowed the forest trails, cutting the house off from the outside world for nearly 3 months. Inside that frozen isolation, the twins worked obsessively. Waldo heard tools moving in the basement almost every night. Sometimes he heard furniture scraping across the floor. Other nights, he heard voices speaking in hushed tones for hours without stopping. And then there were the moments that disturb him the most, the long silences. Entire nights where the house felt too quiet, as if everyone inside was holding their breath at the same time. Phoebe's pregnancy advanced quickly during that winter. Her pale face grew thinner, her movements slower, yet her eyes remained sharp and focused. Wilbert stayed close to her constantly, almost protective, but there was no tenderness in the way he watched her. It was the careful attention of someone observing a process that must not fail. By the time the snow began to melt and the roads reopened in early spring, something had changed inside the house forever. The twins had prepared for the child with an intensity that Waldo could not understand. And deep in the basement, behind newly reinforced doors and freshly placed locks, spaces had been built that no ordinary family would ever need. The birth was coming soon, but the twins were not waiting for a child the way parents normally do. They were waiting for results. The night the first child arrived, the storm came with it. Thunder rolled across the Kansas plains like distant artillery, and rain slammed against the wooden walls of the Oates house as if nature itself were trying to force its way inside. Waldo woke just after midnight to a sound he had been both expecting and fearing for months: Phoebe's scream. It wasn't the scream of surprise. It was the scream of something ancient and violent forcing its way into the world. He rushed toward the master bedroom, but before he could reach the door, Wilbert stepped into the hallway and blocked his path. The look in his eyes stopped Waldo cold. There was no panic in them, no urgency, no fear for Phoebe's life, only control. "Go back to bed," Wilbert said quietly. Waldo tried to push past him, but Wilbert didn't move. The young man had grown stronger over the years, broad from sawmill work and hardened by isolation. Phoebe screamed again. The sound cut through the hallway like a blade. "Let me help her," Waldo said. Wilbert slowly shook his head. "No," he replied. "We prepared for this." Prepared. The word echoed in Waldo's mind as the hours dragged by. The screams continued, sometimes rising, sometimes fading, but never stopping. And beneath them, something else whispers, low voices from inside the room. Phoebe speaks between waves of pain. Wilbert answered calmly, guiding her, instructing her, not like a husband, like a researcher conducting a procedure. Outside, the storm intensified. The wind howled through the trees, and lightning flashed across the windows in blinding bursts of white. By the time the screams finally stopped, dawn was beginning to bleed into the sky. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Waldo waited nearly 20 minutes before the bedroom door finally creaked open. Wilbert stood there, pale but composed. "You can come in now," he said. Inside the room, the air smelled of iron and antiseptic. Phoebe lay in the bed, exhausted but strangely peaceful, cradling something in her arms. For a moment, Waldo couldn't see the child clearly. Then Phoebe turned slightly, and the sight made his stomach twist violently. The baby was alive, but something about her body was terribly wrong. Her hands had extra fingers, 6 on one side, 7 on the other. Her skull curved in an unnatural shape, the bone rising slightly higher than normal at the back. Her eyes, barely open, seemed too large for her small face. Waldo felt a wave of horror rising in his chest. But the most disturbing part was not the child. It was the twins. Phoebe was smiling. Wilbert stood beside her, staring down at the baby with intense fascination. Not sadness, not fear, fascination. Perfect, Phoebe whispered. Wilbert nodded slowly. Exactly as predicted. Predicted. The word struck Waldo harder than anything he had heard that night. These weren't parents reacting to a tragic birth. They were observers studying an outcome. Phoebe gently ran her fingers across the child's strange hands, as if examining delicate craftsmanship. Our bloodline is revealing itself, she murmured. Waldo stepped back, feeling suddenly like a stranger in his own home. He wanted to speak, to shout, to demand that they call a doctor. But deep down, he already knew something terrible. The twins did not see the child's deformities as a tragedy. They saw them as confirmation, proof that their plan was working. And that night, as the storm finally faded beyond the hills, something else quietly took its first breath inside the Oates house. Not just a child, but the beginning of a dynasty built on forbidden blood. After the child was born, the house changed in a way that Waldo could feel in his bones. Silence became heavier, not the peaceful silence of a quiet countryside home, but the suffocating silence of a place where something unnatural had begun to grow. The baby rarely cried. That was the first thing Waldo noticed. Most newborns filled a house with constant noise, hunger, discomfort, life announcing itself every hour of the day. But this child was different. She made sounds, yes, soft, strange murmurs that sometimes came in the middle of the night. But they weren't normal cries. They sounded almost thoughtful, as if the baby were trying to form something more complex than a simple scream. Phoebe rarely let anyone near her. The child never left the master bedroom. Even Waldo, the girl's grandfather, was allowed to see her for only a few minutes at a time. And every time he entered that room, he felt the same cold discomfort. Phoebe and Wilbur were always studying her, watching her, measuring her. There were notebooks stacked on the bedside table now. Waldo once glanced at a page when Wilbert stepped away. He wished he hadn't. Dates, numbers, body measurements, finger lengths, skull angles, reaction times. But the most disturbing entries were the notes written beside them. Deviation promising, further mutation possible, line stability improving. They weren't raising a child. They were documenting a process. Weeks passed, then months, and slowly, something even more unsettling began to reveal itself. The child was developing faster than normal. Too fast. By the time she was 3 months old, she could already focus her eyes on movement across the room. By 5 months, she could sit upright without help. And sometimes when Waldo stood in the doorway, the baby would stare directly at him with an expression that did not belong on the face of an infant. It wasn't curiosity, it was awareness. Phoebe noticed it too. Waldo felt anger rising in his chest. That child is not an experiment. Phoebe tilted her head slightly. That depends, she replied, on what you believe the purpose of blood truly is. The word sent a chill through Waldo's spine, because the twins had started talking about blood more and more, bloodlines, purity, inherited power and something they kept calling the correction of dilution. Then, 8 months after the first child was born, Phoebe announced she was pregnant again. The room fell silent. Waldo felt the air leave his lungs. It had happened too quickly, too deliberately. Wilbert simply nodded and reached for his notebook. Phoebe placed a hand gently over her stomach. But instead of the warm smile of a mother, her lips curved into something colder, something calculated. Now, she whispered, we refine the design. The second pregnancy moved faster than the first, not biologically, but psychologically, because this time the twins were no longer experimenting in uncertainty. They believed they understood the pattern. Phoebe no longer hid her notebooks. In fact, she seemed proud of them. Pages filled with observations, diagrams, measurements, comparisons between the first child and the unborn one. Wilbert expanded the basement during those months. Waldo heard the digging almost every night. Wood is being cut, metal scraping. Heavy objects are dragged across the floor below. At first, Waldo assumed it was storage space. Then one night, he asked Wilbert directly, "What are you building down there?" Wilbert paused in the doorway. Then he answered with unsettling calm, "Rooms." "Rooms for what?" Waldo asked. Wilbert studied him for a moment. "For the future." That was the only explanation he ever gave. Meanwhile, the first child continued to develop. And the more she grew, the more disturbing her presence became. She was not slow. She was not weak. She was observant. Too observant. By 10 months old, she rarely made infant sounds anymore. Instead, she watched everything around her with quiet intensity. Sometimes Waldo would catch her staring at him from across the room, and the feeling was impossible to explain. It felt less like a baby looking at a man, and more like a mind studying a specimen. Phoebe adored it. She spent hours documenting every movement the child made. But something strange began happening. The second baby inside her was behaving differently. The pregnancy was calm. Too calm. No complications. No estrange symptoms. No physical abnormalities. Even Phoebe admitted something felt off. One evening, Wilbert reviewed his notes at the dinner table. "This one may not develop the same way," he said. Phoebe frowned. "What?" Wilbert tapped the notebook slowly. Perhaps the line corrected itself. That possibility seemed to disturb them both, because their goal wasn't to raise normal children. Their goal was something else, something they believed their bloodline was capable of producing. Winter arrived early that year, and with it came the birth of the second child, a boy. This time, Waldo was allowed inside the room sooner. And the moment he saw the baby, he felt overwhelming relief. The boy looked normal, completely normal, healthy skin, 10 fingers, 10 toes, perfect skull shape, no deformities, no estrange proportions, just an ordinary newborn. Waldo felt tears in his eyes, but when he looked at Phoebe and Wilbert, their expressions were cold. Phoebe stared at the baby silently. Wilbert flipped through his notebook. Then he sighed. "Failure," he said quietly. Waldo felt anger explode in his chest. "That is your son," he shouted. Phoebe slowly shook her head. "No," she replied. "That is an interruption." And from that moment on, the twins began treating the two children very differently. The first child, the special one, received constant care and attention. The second child, the failure, was often left alone, hours at a time. Days sometimes passed where Waldo was the only person who even checked on him. And late at night, when the house should have been silent, Waldo began hearing something new, a sound rising from the basement. A child is crying, but it was never the boy upstairs, which meant only one thing. There was another child somewhere in that house, and no one had told him about it. At first, Waldo tried to convince himself he was imagining it. Old houses make noises. Wood contracts in the cold. Wind squeezes through cracks. Pipes echo through the floorboards. But the sound he kept hearing at night was not wind. It was a child, a small, fragile cry, muffled, distant, coming from somewhere beneath the house. The basement, the place Wilbert had been expanding for months. the place that the twins had forbidden him from entering. For weeks, Waldo ignored it, because sometimes the most terrifying truth is the one a man chooses not to investigate. But the crying kept returning. Not every night, just often enough to remind him it was real. And the strange thing was this: the crying never lasted long. It would begin softly. A weak whimper echoes through the floorboards. Then it would suddenly stop, abruptly, as if someone had silenced it. One night, Waldo finally decided he had heard enough. The house was quiet. Phoebe and Wilbert had gone to their bedroom hours earlier. The two babies upstairs had not made a sound. But the cry came again, thin, desperate, from below. Waldo lit a lantern and walked toward the basement door. The air felt colder there. He placed his hand on the knob. Locked. Of course it was locked. He knocked once. No answer. He knocked again. Still silence. Then suddenly, footsteps. Slow footsteps descending the stairs from the second floor. Phoebe appeared in the hallway behind him. Her pale face was illuminated by the lantern light. Her voice was calm. Too calm. "You shouldn't be here." Waldo turned toward her. "There's a child down there," he said. Phoebe didn't deny it. She simply studied him. Then she asked something that made his stomach turn. "Did you hear suffering?" Waldo frowned. "What?" Phoebe tilted her head slightly. "Did the cry sound painful?" Waldo hesitated. "No," she nodded slowly. "There is no problem." That answer froze the air between them. Waldo's voice hardened. "What are you keeping down there?" Phoebe's eyes drifted toward the basement door, then back to Waldo. "Possibility," she whispered. Before Waldo could react, Wilbert's voice came from the darkness behind them. "You're disrupting the process." Waldo turned. Wilbert stood at the end of the hallway, holding one of his notebooks. His face showed no emotion, only calculation. "Children develop differently in controlled environments," Wilbert continued. "Isolation produces stronger results." Waldo felt anger rising again. "You're talking about them like animals." Wilbert slowly closed the notebook. "No," he replied. "Animals don't carry legacy." Then he walked forward, unlocked the basement door, and pulled it open just enough to step inside. Before closing it again behind him, the crying stopped immediately, and Waldo stood there in the hallway, lantern trembling in his hand, realizing something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The twins weren't simply raising children. They were testing them. And whatever was happening in that basement was only the beginning. By the spring of 1905, the house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a laboratory. The children upstairs lived in silence. The children below lived in secrecy. And Waldo lived in fear. Not fear of the outside world, but fear of the two people he had raised since birth. Phoebe and Wilbert no longer behaved like ordinary human beings. They moved with purpose, spoke with precision, and treated everything around them as part of design. Even their children, especially their children. The first daughter, the one with deformities, had grown stronger than anyone expected. She was barely 2 years old, yet she walked earlier than most children. Her fingers, the extra ones, moved constantly, tapping surfaces, tracing shapes, touching objects with unsettling curiosity. Phoebe recorded everything. The way the girl reacted to light, the sound she preferred, how long she could remain completely silent while watching someone. Wilbert measured her skull every month. Her bone structure fascinated him. But the boy, the normal boy, they barely looked at him anymore. He spent most of his days alone in a small bedroom upstairs. Sometimes Waldo would sit with him, feeding him, rocking him to sleep. And every time he did, the same thought burned in his mind. The boy was healthy, perfectly healthy. Yet, to his parents, he was useless. One night, Waldo asked Wilbert directly, "Why do you ignore him?" Wilbert answered without looking up from his notes, "Because he offers nothing new." Waldo clenched his fists. "That's your son." Wilbert turned a page slowly. He is repetition. Then he added something colder. "History remembers innovation, not copies." But the real horror of the house lived beneath the floorboards. Because the crying Waldo had heard weeks earlier had not stopped. In fact, it had multiplied. Sometimes at night, there were two voices. Sometimes three different pitches, different rhythms. Children, more children. Waldo counted the pregnancies, the births, the timelines, and something stopped making sense. Phoebe had given birth 3 times, but the basement sounded like it held more than 3 children. Far more. One evening, Waldo confronted Phoebe again. "How many children are there?" he demanded. Phoebe stared at him with quiet patience. Then she asked a question of her own. "Do you measure family by blood or by outcome?" Waldo felt the floor shift beneath him. "What does that mean?" Phoebe smiled faintly. "A dynasty requires selection." Those words echoed in his mind long after she left the room, because suddenly something terrible became clear. The twins weren't just creating children. They were choosing which ones deserved to survive. And somewhere in the dark rooms beneath that house, the ones who didn't meet their expectations were being kept alive for reasons Waldo did not yet understand. The human mind has a strange defense mechanism. When a truth becomes too horrifying to accept, it quietly reshapes reality so a man can continue breathing without collapsing under its weight. For months, Waldo lived inside that fragile illusion. He told himself that the crime beneath the house was temporary, that Phoebe and Wilbert were simply misguided, that perhaps the children down there were sick and needed isolation. But deep inside, a darker understanding was growing. Every night, the sounds continued. Sometimes it was crying, sometimes scratching, sometimes a low murmur that sounded almost like children attempting to speak through exhaustion. The basement had become a world of its own, a hidden chamber beneath the family home where something unnatural was unfolding. One evening, while Phoebe and Wilbert were away at the sawmill, Waldo found something he had never seen before. Wilbert had left one of his notebooks on the kitchen table. The pages were filled with diagrams of skulls, bone measurements, body ratios, and handwritten observations written with cold precision. Each page described a child not by name, but by classification. Subject 1, exceptional cranial structure. Subject 2, standard development, low potential. Subject 3, severe structural deviation, promising neurological reaction. Waldo's hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. There were far more entries than there had been births. The twins had not been recording 3 children or even 4. The list stretched across dozens of pages. Each entry is marked with dates, observations, and a final note written in darker ink. Retained, removed, or transfer below. That final phrase made Waldo's stomach turn cold. Transfer below. The words confirmed what he had feared but never dared to speak aloud. The basement was not simply a place of isolation. It was a place of selection. Phoebe and Wilbert were studying their own children as if they were breeding experiments. Some were kept upstairs. Others were moved into the hidden chambers below the house, separated from light, separated from the world, left to develop under conditions only the twins understood. Waldo closed the notebook slowly, feeling as if he had just looked into the mind of something no longer human. And in that moment, he realized something even more terrifying. The twins were not ashamed of what they were doing. They believed they were perfecting something. They believed they were building the beginning of a new bloodline, a dynasty born not from love, but from calculated design. One evening, while Phoebe and Wilbert were away at the sawmill, Waldo found something he had never seen before. Wilbert had left one of his notebooks on the kitchen table. The pages were filled with diagrams of skulls, bone measurements, body ratios, and handwritten observations written with cold precision. Each page described a child not by name, but by classification. Subject 1, exceptional cranial structure. Subject 2, standard development, low potential. Subject 3, severe structural deviation, promising neurological reaction. Waldo's hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. There were far more entries than there had been births. The twins had not been recording 3 children, or even 4. The list stretched across dozens of pages. Each entry is marked with dates, observations, and a final note written in darker ink, retained, removed, or transfer below. That final phrase made Waldo's stomach turn cold. Transfer below. The words confirmed what he had feared but never dared to speak aloud. The basement was not simply a place of isolation. It was a place of selection. Phoebe and Wilbert were studying their own children as if they were breeding experiments. Some were kept upstairs. Others were moved into the hidden chambers below the house, separated from light, separated from the world, left to develop under conditions only the twins understood. Waldo closed the notebook slowly, feeling as if he had just looked into the mind of something no longer human. And in that moment, he realized something even more terrifying. The twins were not ashamed of what they were doing. They believed they were perfecting something. They believed they were building the beginning of a new bloodline, a dynasty born not from love, but from calculated design. By the summer of 1905, the Oates house had transformed completely. It no longer resembled a home where a family might laugh, eat together, or share simple moments. It had become a fortress of secrecy and quiet terror. Waldo could feel it in every corner. The walls seemed to absorb the whispers of the basement. The floors groaned with the weight of hidden lives, and the air carried a faint, almost metallic tang that made him uneasy. The twins moved through the house with an unnerving precision, their steps calculated, their words measured. Every action, every glance between Phoebe and Wilbert seemed part of a larger plan that Waldo could not fully comprehend. The first child, the special one, now toddled across the floor with a strange grace, her extra fingers brushing surfaces as if cataloging the world around her. Wilbert's notebook always followed, filled with meticulous notes, developmental milestones, behavioral patterns, and measurements of her unique body. The boy, the failure, was increasingly neglected, left to wander the upstairs rooms alone, his presence barely acknowledged, as if he were an afterthought in a grand design he could not yet perceive. Waldo began noticing subtle changes in the twins' behavior. They no longer spoke to him about their plans, no longer attempted to justify their actions. Instead, they whispered constantly to each other in a language of gestures and glances that left Waldo feeling like an intruder in his own home. The basement, which had become the true heart of their experiments, produced sounds that he could no longer ignore. The crying was joined by a soft murmuring, and sometimes faint laughter that twisted into something grotesque under the house's low ceilings. One night, curiosity overcame fear. Waldo moved silently to the basement door, heart hammering in his chest. He placed his hand on the knob, hesitated, and then listened. Faint scratching, the low hum of voices, and then silence. Every instinct screamed at him to open the door, but he could not. The twins had built a barrier not just of locks and boards, but of psychological control, of power, of a quiet menace that prevented him from acting. He realized then that the dynasty Phoebe and Wilbur were creating was not only a corruption of blood, but a corruption of the mind. Every child they produced, every note they recorded, every choice to isolate or ignore was a step towards something that defied morality, a future that Waldo could neither stop nor fully comprehend. The weight of it pressed on him day and night, a constant reminder that the forbidden knowledge he had glimpsed came with a price. And yet, he could not look away. By late 1905, the twins' obsession had reached new heights. Phoebe and Wilbur no longer confined themselves to the study of their children. They were now orchestrating every element of their environment, every sound, every shadow, every pattern of light in the house. Waldo noticed subtle modifications in the upstairs rooms. Windows partially boarded, doors reinforced, furniture rearranged with precise intent. Even the garden outside was pruned in perfect symmetry, paths measured with exact angles, as if the entire property were a controlled experiment designed to shape the inhabitants within it. The children upstairs reflected the twins' cold planning. The first child, the special one, was learning faster than any child her age, imitating speech before her second birthday, walking with uncanny balance, her eyes always watching, always analyzing. The boy, the failure, remained mostly silent, a shadow of presence, existing rather than living. And below the house, the basement murmured with life that should not exist, a hidden network of rooms where Waldo could hear the cries, whispers, and occasional laughter of children whose names and faces he had never been allowed to know. It was during one of these nights that Homer Mixon, the local hunter who had begun observing the Oates property from a distance, noticed something that made his blood run cold. He had been watching the house through the tree lean, seeing shadows moving unnaturally together, seeing smoke rising from the chimney, even on nights too warm for a fire. Lights flickered in the basement windows at odd hours. Occasionally, small shapes could be glimpsed in the dim glow, figures moving in patterns too deliberate to be random. Homer's curiosity, a trait honed by years surviving in danger, forced him closer. He moved silently through the forest, studying the Oates family from afar. Every observation added to a growing horror he could not yet articulate. There was something fundamentally wrong here, something that defied normal morality. The twins were not just raising children, they were breeding, cataloging, and conditioning them. Each act, each whisper, each notebook entry was a layer of control, a step in a deliberate plan that no outsider could comprehend. And the worst part? The twins believed they were justified. They believed the future they were shaping, even if it involved pain, neglect, or isolation, was a legacy worth creating, a dynasty of their own design, untouchable and unstoppable. Waldo began noticing subtle changes in himself, too. Nights became restless. Dreams turned to nightmares filled with whispers and shadows. The cries from below the house lingered in his mind, even when the rooms were empty. Fear was no longer a simple reaction. It had become a constant companion, a lens through which he saw the twins' actions. He realized that this was not merely a family secret. It was a psychological prison. And the deeper he tried to understand it, the more he felt himself being drawn into the twins' world, into their controlled, perfected, horrifying vision. By the end of 1905, the twins' fixation had mutated into something monstrous. The basement was no longer just a hidden chamber. It had become a carefully controlled environment. Each room was partitioned, measured, and designed to isolate its occupant completely. Waldo could hear the soft cries and occasional low laughter that seemed almost unnatural. The children below were no longer merely hidden. They were being observed, cataloged, and conditioned. The twins had begun labeling them not by name, but by characteristics, the special one, the failure, the improved. Every action, every cry, every gesture was meticulously recorded. Phoebe would sit for hours with her notebooks, pen scratching across pages as Wilbert measured physical dimensions, counted fingers and toes, tested reflexes, and noted responses to stimuli. The house itself had become an extension of their experiments. Doors locked, windows barred, rooms reconfigured, and even the lighting manipulated to produce specific effects on the children's behavior. Waldo tried to confront them, tried to demand explanations, but each time, the twins' calm, controlled responses crushed his courage. "This is evolution," Wilbert would say, voice low, deliberate. "This is selection. Legacy is born from refinement, not chance." Phoebe would nod, adding, "History remembers innovation, not repetition." Their words were not meant to persuade. They were doctrines, truths they had internalized, and now they were forcing Waldo to witness their version of reality. He began to understand that resistance was futile. Their control was absolute, and his moral outrage meant nothing in the face of their obsession. Homer Mixon, still observing from the forest, finally gathered the courage to approach the property. He saw the modifications, the lights, and the strange patterns of movement inside the house, and he sensed what Waldo had only begun to grasp. The twins were building more than a family. They were building a dynasty in their own image, and they would stop at nothing. Homer est un crime de danger. Every hunter, every man who has spent a lifetime facing wild beasts, knows the smell of evil when it crosses his path. And Homer had smelled it. He moved closer, silently observing, witnessing shadows moving in coordination, notes being taken, children isolated, cries muffled by the floorboards. He saw the twins' devotion to their work, their perfect synchronization, their obsession with legacy. But the most chilling revelation came when he heard the voices of the children. Not upstairs, not those with deformities or health, but those below. The basement echoed with sounds that no child should ever produce. Whispered words, repetitive chants, a strange intelligence in their cries. Homer realized with horror that the twins were not simply raising children. They were creating something else entirely. Something designed, shaped, and controlled from birth. And he understood, in the deepest part of his being, that anyone who interfered would disappear, just like the unknown others whose fates were already sealed in those hidden rooms. The twins' dynasty was no longer theoretical. It was alive, and the basement was its incubator. As he neared the basement, he caught sight of Phoebe's pale face framed by the doorway, watching him with an unsettling calm. Wilbert appeared beside her, notebook in hand, and for a moment, Homer felt the weight of two minds calculating every possible outcome of his presence. He realized then that the twins had anticipated this intrusion. The basement was not only a prison, it was a fortress, both physically and psychologically, designed to control anyone who dared approach. Homer's heart pounded as he considered the children, the experiments, and the meticulously planned dynasty growing in that house. Each secret he uncovered added another layer to his horror. And yet, even as fear threatened to paralyze him, a part of him, the part that had survived wars, storms, and wild beasts, refused to turn away. He had to witness it. He had to know the full scope of the twins' plan. That night, under the pale light of the moon, Homer prepared to cross the threshold into darkness. What he would see would not only seal his fate, but reveal the true horror lurking in the hidden chambers of the Oates dynasty. Homer had never felt fear like this. Not in war, not in storms, not in the depths of the wilderness. This was different. This was deliberate. This was human minds, sharp and precise, shaping reality into something monstrous. He moved silently to the basement window that had been left slightly ajar, peering through the thin slats of wood. What he saw made every instinct scream at him to run, to abandon curiosity, to forget the horrors he had glimpsed. But he could not. He was rooted to the spot by the unbearable weight of revelation. Inside, the basement had been divided into compartments, each carefully measured and walled off. Small rooms, almost like cells, held children of all ages. Some were curled in fetal positions, eyes wide and alert. Others were sitting silently, staring at walls or floors, their movements deliberate, almost rehearsed. The twins moved among them with methodical care, carrying trays of food, whispering instructions, jotting down notes, measuring limbs, counting fingers, adjusting posture. But the sound that froze Homer in place was not the scribbling of notes, nor the soft commands of the twins. It was the children themselves. Their cries and murmurs were not random. They were patterned, almost musical in cadence. It was as if the twins had taught them a language of suffering, obedience, and calculation, shaping their responses to create something beyond ordinary comprehension. Homer realized the full extent of the twins' design. These were not merely children. They were experiments in human potential and human control. Each one had been evaluated, cataloged, and assigned a purpose. The first child, with her deformities, had been transformed into something the twins considered perfect, her body and mind honed according to a standard only they understood. The boy, normal and unremarkable, had been dismissed, left to languish in irrelevance. And the others, the ones he could only hear, not see clearly, they were being conditioned, their fates determined by nothing other than the twins' obsessive calculations. It was in that moment, as Homer crouched in the shadows, that he understood something horrifying. The twins' dynasty was already in motion. The house was a crucible, the children its alchemy, and the twins themselves the architects of a terrifying legacy. And then he realized why the first man who had tried to approach, the men who had asked questions, had vanished. They had underestimated the twins. They had failed to recognize the calculated, relentless precision of their control. Homer now understood that any interference, any attempt to expose the truth, would be met with the same fate. And yet, in that instant, he knew the danger was greater than himself. The true horror was not just what the twins had done, but what they intended to continue doing, shaping the future in their own image. One carefully measured, controlled, and utterly unflinching. Homer's presence in the shadows had not gone unnoticed. The twins, as always, were aware, two minds operating with the precision of a single predator. Phoebe and Wilbert moved through the basement as if guided by instinct, their glances sweeping every corner, every compartment, every child. Homer could see it now. The small adjustments, the subtle hand movements, the way the twins' bodies mirrored each other in perfect synchronization. This was not parenting. This was control in its purest form, a domination over life itself. Every step he took, every breath he stifled, was part of a game he was not supposed to play. Suddenly, a light flicked on in the far corner, illuminating the first child, the special one. She stood unnaturally still, her eyes catching the glow like polished glass. Homer's stomach churned. There was something in her gaze, a calculated awareness far beyond her age. He realized, with a chill that ran from his neck to his toes, that the twins had instilled in their children a sense of obedience that bordered on unnatural intelligence. It was terrifying in its subtlety. The children were not violent, not overtly dangerous, but their minds were shaped to follow, to execute, to endure whatever the twins demanded. The boy, the one dismissed as the failure, huddled in the shadows, his eyes wide and empty, a silent witness to the manipulation, a product of neglect and abandonment. Homer's hand trembled as he clutched the tree trunk behind which he had been hiding. The twins moved closer to the window he had been peering through. Phoebe's voice, soft and deliberate, carried down into the shadows. Every life here has purpose. Wilbert's response was almost inaudible, but precise. Every trait accounted for. They were speaking in their language of lineage, of control, of what they believed was perfection. And in that moment, Homer realized the truth that would haunt him forever. The Oates twins were not mad. They were architects of a philosophy so cold and calculated that morality could not touch it. They were creating a bloodline, a dynasty, a system where only their vision mattered, and the rest of the world, including the children themselves, was expendable. Homer knew he had to retreat, yet he could not leave without witnessing the full measure of their obsession. He watched as the twins moved between compartments, feeding, observing, measuring. Each child was treated according to a strict hierarchy of value and expectation. The cries, the whispers, the silent obedience. It was all part of a cruel calculus that Homer had no words for. And then, as if sensing his gaze, the twins paused, their heads turning almost simultaneously toward the basement window he hid behind. Homer froze. He knew in that moment that discovery was inevitable. And in their eyes, he saw the promise of absolute control, the chilling certainty that nothing and no one would be allowed to interfere with the dynasty they were building. Homer Mixon's fate was sealed the moment the twins became aware of him. Their awareness was instantaneous, almost preternatural, a product of years spent observing, calculating, and controlling every movement in and around the house. Phoebe and Wilbert moved with deliberate precision, their steps silent yet deliberate, their gazes locking in an unspoken agreement. Homer, despite all his experience in tracking, hunting, and survival, knew in his bones that he had crossed a line no one survived. The forest itself seemed to conspire against him, the branches snagging, the underbrush catching his feet, slowing him, hurting him toward inevitability. The twins did not need to act openly. Their presence alone was a force that bent reality around their will. Inside the basement, the children, those trapped and conditioned in the labyrinth of compartments, watched with eyes shaped by the twins' obsessive design. Each had been taught, subtly, to recognize intrusions, to respond according to the rules set for them. Homer had not seen the full extent yet, but he could hear it. Soft footfalls, whispers in unison, the faintest shuffle of measured steps. The twins' children were instruments, extensions of their minds, trained to perceive and react before a threat could fully manifest. And Homer, despite his skill and cunning, realized that he was no longer observing the twins' work. He had become part of it, part of the experiment. By dawn, Homer had vanished. His rifle was found abandoned a mile from the property, his tracks lost in the forest. No one in Crater Lake could explain his disappearance, though whispers began immediately. People avoided the Oates property as if sensing a malignancy, an unseen hand that could reach through the trees and snatch those foolish enough to approach. Waldo, haunted by what he had glimpsed of the twins' obsession, could only tremble in silence, powerless to intervene. The twins maintained their composure, offering sympathy to anyone asking about Homer's fate, their performance flawless, their intent invisible to all but the most perceptive. The legend of the Oates twins spread quietly. A whisper carried through the community like a shadow that could not be touched. Hunters, travelers, and neighbors altered their paths to avoid the property, instinctively aware of the danger that lurked behind its locked doors and boarded windows. The twins had achieved more than secrecy. They had built an aura of impenetrable fear, a psychological fortress surrounding the dynasty they were creating. And within the house, the children continued to exist according to the precise hierarchy and conditioning the twins demanded. Every day, every note, every observation added to the quiet horror. A family designed, perfected, and controlled in ways that defied morality, law, and human empathy. Homer's disappearance was only the beginning. It was a warning, a testament to the lengths the twins would go to protect their secret, and a chilling reminder that some knowledge comes with a cost too great to survive. The Oates twins' dynasty did not end with Homer Mixon's disappearance. It had only begun. Over the years, the house became a temple of obsession, the basement its sanctum, the children its living instruments. Phoebe and Wilbert moved with the same cold precision that had marked every step of their plan, their synchronized minds orchestrating every detail of life, growth, and development. Each child was cataloged, measured, and conditioned according to the twins' vision of perfection, the hierarchy of deformity and normalcy, strength and weakness, obedience and deviation. The first child, deformed yet revered by the twins, became the embodiment of their philosophy, a control achievement, a manifestation of a will that refused compromise. The boy, the failure, languished in deliberate neglect, a counterpoint in their cruel calculus. Others followed, each molded to serve a role in the dynasty that no outsider could understand. The house itself transformed alongside its inhabitants. Doors reinforced, windows obscured, rooms restructured into laboratories of observation, light manipulated to influence sleep, mood, and perception. The twins' control extended beyond the walls. They dictated patterns of thought, reactions, and even emotions. Waldo, once the head of the household, became a ghost in his own home, unable to interfere, his sanity fraying under the weight of daily exposure to their methods. He watched, powerless, as the twins shaped lives in a way that was methodical, calculating, and terrifyingly complete. Their vision of legacy was not natural. It was deliberate, designed, and ruthlessly maintained. And yet, what is perhaps the darkest truth is that the twins believed they were doing good. In their minds, the dynasty they created, the children they molded, was a higher form of order, a control perfection that history would eventually recognize. They were architects of a human experiment, immune to moral judgment, and untouchable because their isolation rendered them invisible to the law and society. Every decision, every measurement, every whisper, and every command reinforced the inevitability of their system. Homer Mixon, Waldo, and anyone else who stumbled too close were removed from the equation, leaving the twins and their creations untouched, unopposed, and entirely self-contained. This is the reality the Oates twins embraced, a dynasty of their own making, built on secrecy, control, and an obsession with purity of line and mind. It is a story that challenges the very boundaries of morality, a glimpse into what happens when isolation, obsession, and intellect converge in completely unrestrained ways. And the chilling lesson lingers. There are truths hidden in history, corners of human experience deliberately obscured, that, once revealed, change the way a man sees the world forever. You now know the story of the twins who married each other and created a dynasty unlike any other, one where power, control, and the human psyche were twisted into a legacy that no one could stop and from which no one could escape. This is not just a tale of the past. It is a warning. Some obsessions survive time, grow in silence, and wait for eyes willing to see them. And once you see them, you cannot unsee.